So thank you very much, Christoph. That was such a fantastic introduction that I really don't need to tell you that much. I'll just show you a lot of photographs and maps that will add to this kind of narrative. But that really is almost the introduction I had prepared, so thanks. That's wonderful. Before I get started, I just want to very quickly acknowledge a number of collaborators on this project that include Andrew Watson, John Bath, and Colin Coates. So some of the work I'm going to show you has basically got a co-author to it. Other stuff I've worked on myself. And 6 graduate and undergraduate students at the University of Saskatchewan who've helped me build the database that I'm going to be showing you the results of. So a group of students have just been punching in trade statistics all winter, and it's really quite wonderful to be a professor and no longer have to punch in the trade statistics myself as I did in my graduate work. It really speeds things along. Okay, so I'm just going to begin by showing this picture of Henry Tate's sugar factory in West Ham, down along the Thames. It's a very large factory. It's built in 1877. It makes sugar cubes primarily, but it's refining raw sugar, both cane sugar and beet sugar, into a mass product that the large population of London consumes. They love sugar in England during the 19th century. It's a big part of the diet. So it's clearly a very energy-intensive factory. It's contributing to the terrible problems of smoke pollution that London suffered during this time. But I had the question in my mind, what environmental consequences were there elsewhere when you start building sugar factories on this scale? Lyle built another sugar factory a kilometer away down the river. They've since combined in the 20th century to be Tate and Lyle, and actually this factory I just showed you still exists, although the EU apparently might shut it down at some point in the next 30 years, so there's concern. So there's sort of a general awareness in environmental history that sugar production caused soil erosion, it caused deforestation. Places like Haiti are a disaster through to today because of the extractive plantation economies. So I've been trying to think about ways to connect these big factories in London with what's happening elsewhere in the world. And of course, this brings up the question of not just what's happening in the sugar factory and the gutta percha factory. We know some of this. There's articles scattered around journals in the past 10 years that explore some of these factories. But what's happening, what's the environmental consequences of the rest of London's industry in the many locations around the world? And is it possible as a historian to try and take a look at that really big picture of the biggest city in the world and all the places it touches? And my answer at this point is I'm still not quite sure, but I'm trying. So I'm going to introduce you to a few basic bits of historiography as I bring us along. There's this notion established in 1925 that the Industrial Revolution didn't really happen in London. The Industrial Revolution happened in Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds, these sort of classic sites of the Cottonopolis in northern England, closer to the coal mines. And this continued to be discussed in the history and the general literature really through to the 1980s. And finally, some historians started to push back a little bit and notice that there's still these big factories, and most of them date back to the 19th century. So there's been some work, but it just seems like an absurd argument that a city that grew from 1 million people to 6.5 million people in the course of the 19th century, this first modern metropolis, was not also a main center in industrial development in the country where the Industrial Revolution happened. So the way I've approached at doing this sort of more systematically than these handful of articles that have argued, we need to pay more attention to industrialization, is I've been able to map just about every factory in London in the second half of the 19th century. And even a few years ago when I started doing GIS work, that would have been nearly impossible because I scanned each individual map, I used Photoshop to stitch them back together, and then I went through and geo-referenced them individually. A few years ago I got access to the entire data set for 2 points in time, the 1860s and the 1890s, where it was 2 days of downloading maps in a really finicky interface, but much better than scanning every single map. So it meant that I could train some students to just go looking through London for all the factories. I'll show you how that's done. You zoom in on the maps, just like we're all familiar with now with Google Maps and Google Earth. You find a factory, you trace it, you punch in the name. I try to identify them all by type, give them a category. We go through a sort of multi-stage error check. Some of my students added a whole lot of granaries. I thought those weren't factories. We pulled them out. We found other ones that were missed. It's fairly straightforward. It involves just following the rivers around. Almost all of the factories are located somewhere along a canal or a river, although there's numerous exceptions in the older part of the city. So this allows us to map every factory. I think I'm close, especially in the second map, we've finished the air control. I think I'm close to having found at least all the big factories, the vast majority of the medium factories, and most of the small factories. So you can see in the 1860s, early 1870s, there's already these major clusters of industry. There's the leather industry that dates back into the 17th and 18th century in that region. There's shipbuilding along the eastern Thames or around the Isle of Dogs. There's the Lower Lee Valley, the West Ham area that I studied in my dissertation. And then as I move forward to the first revision of the map, you can see a dramatic expansion east in West Ham, so this area. But I'll go back and forth a few times. You can also see there's quite a bit of growth out here. In the scale of the factories, there's more really big factories in this second map from 1893 and 1895. So again, large clusters of factories. They're not hugely changed. There's a new one. There's Silvertown. This is where that sugar factory, the 2 sugar factories are located. They're bigger factories than in most of the rest of London. There's one section that retracts. Some of the shipbuilding shuts down right here at the bottom of the Isle of Dogs, and that's sort of the main evidence that historians pointed to as the collapse of these shipping firms, that industrialization failed in England. But when we look at this map on the broader scale, in London, we see that clearly industry was well established by the end of the 19th century. Now, it's possible to label all these maps, but you actually very quickly end up with way too much information to produce for a static map like this on a PowerPoint slide, and even, it's next to impossible to get all this information into a journal or a book article page. So the next step is to make this map interactive. I've got a work in progress version of that, where you can now go on, you can zoom into any part of London and click on any of these polygons and find out what kind of factory it was, and we'll be adding to that in the months ahead. So here's some of the major categories of industry I've found in London. A lot of them service these millions of people, so they make soap for them, sugar for them. They grind the flour, mill the flour. All kinds of consumable goods are one of the big focus, but there's also some major export markets. They make much of the quinine that allows Europeans to go to the tropics and hopefully not die of malaria. They make the underwater telegraph cables that increasingly connect the world together. So there's a considerable export market happening here in London as well. So again, I'm going to pause and talk a bit about the historiography, because in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s, we largely decided that there was no industrial revolution. So again, that seems a bit absurd given the maps I've just shown you of all these factories appearing by the end of the 19th century. But what confounded economic historians is they reproduced GDP estimates for 300 years, for the 150 years leading up to 1750, the 150 years following 1750, and they found that it looked almost the same, that there was steady but quite small, normally under 1% of GDP growth per year, and it just doesn't look like anything revolutionary happened in the economy in those key decades after the steam engine's invented and the railroads start to get established. It doesn't happen until the mid-19th century. So environmental history has really been key in the past decade or so to start to reestablish. We're talking about an industrial revolution again. And we're no longer looking for this kind of takeoff point driven by technology like the steam engine, but Wrigley has convinced us, or convinced a lot of us, that instead we should be looking at why the Industrial Revolution didn't stop, why this economic growth continued year after year, decade after decade, century after century, without hitting up against the limits of the amount of materials you could produce in the land in England. You have a limited number of forests to create charcoal. You have a limited amount of space to grow food. The population's growing. If you want to develop an industrial revolution based on clothing, on cloth, then you need a lot more space for jute or for sheep to produce the fibers that you might, or not jute, for linen, to produce the fibers out of flax. So the question is not why it started, but why it didn't stop. That's a really important innovation. And Pomerantz is kind of built on this. He's an environmental historian, economic historian of China, and he was always sort of confused by how Western historians didn't pay much attention to what was happening in China and the economic dynamism of the 18th century. They were growing in a very similar way that Western Europe was growing. But in the 19th century, China goes through a century of protracted decline, almost 2 centuries of economic turmoil, whereas the West, we have this great divergence, hence the name of the book. And so he argues that it's not just coal that Wrigley focused on, this vast expansion of the energy supply by tapping into hydrocarbons, but it's also something he names ghost acres. So it's the cotton from the United States of America and sugar from the Caribbean that alleviates pressure on the acreage of Britain and Western Europe more generally, and allows them to continue expanding their production without hitting up against an ecological limit. Keep hitting the wrong button. And so those 2 books are published in around 2000. And I think the main contribution that those of us are sort of more inclined to environmental history than economic history is to expand on this idea of ghost acres and look at how there were dramatic environmental consequences in the places where we were extracting this material that allowed for that profound economic growth in Britain, in the east coast of the United States and Canada and all these countries that develop in the 19th century. And so we have examples now with Cushman's recent book on guano, with Jim Webb's book on cinchona, coffee and tea in the highlands of Sri Lanka, and many more that I'm sure probably some people in the room have contributed to writing. So this gets me back to the factories of London. And the first example doesn't really support my thesis all that well. The biggest factories are coal gas factories. They are not relying on distant ghost acres. They're relying on coal from Newcastle, coal from Cardiff, but they do support Wrigley's core argument that London is just becoming much more reliant on fossil fuels during the 19th century. Other major factories are iron shipbuilding yards, arms and munition plants, railway works. These are the largest factories you find on the map. Again, they're not using a whole lot of material from tropical plantations, but they are relying on mines all over the world increasingly. You find in the trade statistics huge quantities of iron ore, of semi-processed iron, of copper, of zinc, of tin, of all these primary metals coming in from an increasingly diverse supply chain. But I think it's, for myself, more interesting to step back and look at the diversity of raw materials. If we get past the 10, 12 topics that most of the environmental historians have focused on, and just look at the 400 different raw materials that are coming into London in the 1860s, I've selected a few that I'm quite sure are connected in one way or another to factories in London. And we can see that some of them are basically augmenting the local supply. Most of these things are available in Britain. They produce it on their farms. They have mines for most of these metals. But they're not producing enough given the scale of industrial development by the second half of the 19th century. So they need more tallow, more lard, more skins, more linseed and hemp and saltpeter and zinc. And then the really interesting thing is to just see how many new, I guess what would have been exotic raw materials come in to the industrial supply chain. The classic example, of course, is rubber, but there's many more, and it's quite dynamic and it changes over the course of the 19th century. At this point in 1865, large numbers of them are somehow connected to making colored dyes. A lot of those things actually decline in the decades that follow because they get better and better at making dyes out of chemicals from those same coal gas plants. They figure out how to make artificial red first, I think, and then continue to get better at a variety of other colors. So you don't need as much madder root from India if you have, I forget the chemical name for the red, but you get it from coal gas. So part of the project is to try and map all those commodities as they come into the country. And I've got 5 data points now, 1861 through to 1901, of everything that's brought into the country where there's both a value and a quantity in the trade statistics. And it makes it possible to go through the years and see how it changes over time. In a big group like this with limited time, there's no way to do it in any detail. And again, you run into the problem that there's just far too much information, especially if I also wanted to show you the quantity and the value of these products. So I'm going to have to build an interactive web site so that you can zoom in to a certain part of the world in a certain year. Here we have Eastern Indian Ocean in the year 1891, and zoom in again to a particular location like the Strait Settlement, where then we can see, okay, that's quite interesting. Tin is the most valuable export coming out. Gutta percha, which is used for those underwater telegraphs, is next. Gambier, which is a tanning agent, next after that, and the list goes on and on. In a web visualization, you'll be able to click on each of those and then explore them in more detail and maybe link back to the factory in London that would have been using all that tin to make cookie tins and other products like that. So with the 7 or 8 minutes that I've got left, this big picture approach can only sort of get us so far. There's just really too much information. It's very hard to tell a coherent story aside from there's a whole lot more factories and they're using products from all kinds of places all over the world. I don't know how to write that into a book. So the next step is to actually single out some of the most interesting industries and treat them individually and explore how their supply chain changed from around 1800 through to the First World War. And so I've done this so far for soap, leather, and a few other industries, and I'm going to give you a quick overview here. Soap is really interesting because the British began to identify soap as a symbol of their civilization. In the 1851 Great Exhibition, the jurors wrote that this is probably the best index for how civilized a nation is. How much soap per person did they use? So sort of this soap civilization index. And they're quite proud to say that by 1851, the British are using 2 pounds of soap per year, more than anybody else. And this has taken up Unilever, actually that's its motto when it's in its advertising in the 1890s, soap is civilization. And Pears has these soap ads that, just terrible, show African people washing and becoming white as they use Pears soap. So it's quite a blunt kind of symbol of progress, industrial and cultural and social in the 19th century. So in 1865, soap factories are growing. They're all connected in with candle factories. They use the same raw materials and tallow melters and oil presses. It doesn't stand out as a huge industry compared to coal gas, but still very significant. I'm just going to compare the John Knight factory in 1865, which was founded in 1830, with its expanded version in Silvertown in 1895. So I kept the scale of these two maps exactly the same, and you can just see it's almost tripled, maybe 4 times the size. So growth on this scale required more and more fat from somewhere in the world, from some kind of supply chain, far more fat than you could get by just going to the local butcher and getting the tallow from the local market. They'd gone well past how much fat could be supplied from animals in England alone. So, yeah. Here's 1895. There's more quite sizable factories. So there's 2 or 3 out here, one more up here. That's a candle factory out in the west. They're more in the sort of 5 acres, 6 acres, very large. And I've got a picture coming up where you can see just how big the John Knight factory was. So they have a huge industrial system. They're using, I think, 16 of these very large boilers to produce up to 300 tons of soap per week. And for the purpose of this paper, what's really interesting is they're using both tallow and they're also pressing 400 tons of cottonseed per week. They use some of that in their soap, but they also sell it off to margarine factories and cookie factories and the edible oil trade. So this brings us back to the turn of the 19th century. Just to give you a quick overview of how diverse and the increase in value of fats coming into the country as the soap industry expands. Here we can see the significant growth in tallow from 20,000 tons in 1800. I'm missing data points here. And a dramatic increase towards the end of the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, it's competing with palm oil, coconut oil, and these other new products for the soap market. Almost all of the tallow comes from the Eurasian steppe in 1800, and that continues through to the mid-19th century. There's more diversity in 1839. But in terms of quantity, still almost all of it's coming from Russia and the Eurasian steppe, Kazakhstan today. It starts to rapidly diversify in the mid-centuries. This is probably mostly because Russian colonists are now plowing up the Eurasian steppe just as Canadian colonists are plowing up the Canadian prairie. So this land is going from pasture to growing wheat and other products like that. But thankfully for the soap makers, there are a lot of sheep in Australia, a lot of cows in western United States that supplement this loss of supply from Russia. So this map is a bit hard for you to see, but there's a few interesting things. We see just the collapse of the Russian supply, the increase of the American supply, and then this massive spike of tallow from New South Wales that I'm trying to figure out, but I think it definitely is connected to the early years of the Confederation drought, that there's environmental factors that are forcing Australian farmers to kill off a lot of their animals, boil them down for tallow, and try and recoup a bit of their loss that way. Here's some of the other products that I still need to explore further. So a whole diversity of other fats have other environmental consequences. Alkali is coming from burnt hardwood trees in North America. Pine resin, essential oils. And finally, I just want to quickly talk to you about tanning and leather. This is work I'm doing in collaboration with Andrew Watson at York University. Tanneries are all mostly focused in Bermondsey, right here in South London. And unlike leather, or unlike soap, where it modernizes, it gets bigger towards the end of the 19th century, this is actually a dying industry. It's been there since the 18th century, and it's facing competition from around the world. So in the 1893, 1895 map, you see a whole lot of them are former tanneries, because they've closed down since the 1860s. This thing keeps jumping on me. It is a similar supply chain in many ways. It's the same cattle that are being used to make tallow are also being used to supply hides. Off the Eurasian steppe in Argentina, this sometimes is the only products they're sending. They can't actually eat all the meat from all the animals they slaughter, so they preserve the hide, they preserve the tallow, and that's where they make their profit. So this diversifies. India becomes a major player, the United States becomes a major player, and increasingly both of them are tanning the hides before sending them to England. So the English leather industry is still doing okay, but they've lost the tanning. Along with all these hides coming from everywhere in the world, basically, by the end of the 19th century, Britain also has got a shortage of oak bark that they can use to tan leather with anymore. They've used it all up, so they're incredibly reliant on bark from other parts of the world. This is very bulky stuff to ship around, but large quantities are still sent. Cutch and Gambier is a tanning agent from India and Singapore. They're cousins of each other. Myrobalans, probably not saying that right, sumac from southern Italy, from India, oak galls from Turkey and China, other bark products from South America. They're reaching out to the world, figuring out what those places use to tan leather, and then they start to import it in great quantities. And this leads to clearing forests to build plantations, or to grow plantations to supply European tanners, London tanners. And so again, we see just a big jump in the diversity of where this stuff's coming from, and huge quantities. 14,000 tons of Cutch and Gambier alone from Singapore. The other big thing that happens, and this is why I'm collaborating with Andrew Watson, is that they start bringing the hides to the bark. So the tanning kind of follows around hemlock trees as they're being overused in eastern North America. So it pushes further and further away from the urban centers, such as Montreal, and into Bracebridge, which is 300 kilometers from Toronto, because there's still hemlock trees left there. So thank you very much. This is the version of the map that's online, so you can go and explore that further, and I look forward to your questions.